What do you feed 1,000 men locked inside a coal mine carved into the side of a Tennessee mountain? At Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, the answer was whatever the mountain gave up and whatever the kitchen could stretch across 1,000 trays a day. Raccoon pulled from the fence line, possum trapped with overripe persimmons, wine fermented from wild grapes and hidden behind ceiling tiles. Number 19 was dragged out of the woods by trustees under armed guard. Number 11 took weeks of stolen sugar packets and a latex glove tied shut at the wrist. And number 1 is a meal so simple that guards admitted years after retirement they never found its equal anywhere. Brushy Mountain sat in the Cumberland Plateau of East Tennessee from 1896 until 2009, surrounded by dense forest, working coal mines, and wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. What they fed the men inside was nothing like what you would expect from a maximum security facility. Hit that subscribe button because these meals will change everything you think you know about life behind those walls. Here are 25 wild meals actually served to prisoners at Brushy Mountain. Number 25. Cornbread baked on coal shovels. The kitchen at Brushy Mountain did not always have enough oven space to feed every man on the schedule. So kitchen trustees improvised with what the mine provided. They greased the flat iron shovels used down in the coal shafts, poured cornmeal batter directly onto the hot metal, and held them over open flame until the edges turned black and crisp and the center set firm. The bread came out dense, smoky, and tasting like the mountain itself. The cornmeal was coarse ground from corn grown on the prison farm, and the batter had no eggs, no milk, and no buttermilk. Just meal, water, salt, and a scrape of lard. Inmates who arrived from county lockups in Nashville or Memphis had never seen bread cooked on mining equipment. For inmates raised in the hollows of East Tennessee, where their grandmothers had done the same thing over a wood stove, it was just another Tuesday morning. Number 24. Pinto beans cooked for 2 days straight. Every prison in the American South served pinto beans. Brushy Mountain served them differently. The kitchen started a cast iron pot on Monday morning and did not pull it off the heat until Wednesday. By then, the liquid had reduced into something thick as gravy. The beans had broken apart into a smooth paste, and the chunks of fatback had dissolved completely into the broth until you could not tell where the pork ended and the beans began. Men ate it with a spoon like soup or spread it cold on bread like butter the next morning. One pot fed hundreds of inmates across multiple meals. The recipe required no skill, no fancy ingredients, and no supervision, just time, low heat, and a pot big enough to hold it all. That recipe held steady across more than a century of continuous operation. Number 23. Whole raccoon roasted in the prison kitchen. Trustees assigned to grounds maintenance worked outside the walls under armed escort. When they found a raccoon caught dead in a fence line or struck by a vehicle on the access road, they hauled the carcass back to the kitchen building. The staff skinned it, soaked the meat overnight in heavy salt water to draw out the wild gaminess, then roasted it whole in a deep pan surrounded by onions and potatoes pulled from the prison garden. The fat rendered down slowly and basted the meat as it cooked until the outside turned dark and crisp. It never appeared on any official weekly menu submitted to the state. The warden looked the other way because every pound of free protein was a pound the budget did not have to cover. Men from the mountains recognized the taste immediately and ate without question. Men from the cities pushed it around the plate and refused to ask what animal it came from. Number 22. Chicory root coffee. Real coffee beans were expensive and usually reserved for the guards' break room. The prisoners drank chicory instead, roasted and ground from thick taproots dug out of the fields surrounding the prison during warm months. The taste was bitter, the color ink dark, and the caffeine content negligible. But it was hot. And in a mountain prison where winter temperatures dropped well below freezing inside the stone cell blocks, A hot cup of anything held value far beyond its flavor. Men traded work assignments and commissary items for a second cup. Kitchen trustees controlled the supply and used it as currency. The grounds were reused and rebrewed until they produced nothing but faintly tinted water, and even then, on the coldest mornings, men drank it standing in the corridor just to hold something warm between their hands. Number 21. Groundhog roasted whole over the cook pit. The fields and rocky hillsides around Brushy Mountain were riddled with groundhog burrows, and the animals grew fat and slow on clover and garden scraps through the warm months. Trusty crews on farm detail dug them out or clubbed them at the burrow entrance and brought them back whole to the kitchen. The cooks gutted and skinned each one, rubbed the carcass with salt and whatever dried pepper they had, then roasted it on a spit over an open pit behind the kitchen building. The meat was dense, dark, and greasy in a way that reminded men of roast pork, though the flavor carried a sharp, wild edge that no farm animal ever had. The fat rendered out in sheets and dripped into the coals, sending up smoke you could smell from the cell blocks. Groundhog was not a delicacy. It was free protein that walked itself onto prison land and required no feed, no pasture, and no paperwork. The state never purchased a single pound of it. Number 20. Sorghum molasses as the only sweetener on the table. There was no white sugar available to inmates at Brushy Mountain for most of its operating history. The only bulk sweetener the kitchen could afford was dark sorghum molasses, pressed and cooked from sorghum cane grown on farms throughout Morgan County and purchased cheap by the barrel. Men poured it over hot biscuits at breakfast, stirred it into their chicory to cut the bitterness, drizzled it across cornbread at supper, or simply ate it straight off a spoon when the craving for something sweet became too strong to ignore. The color was nearly black. The taste landed somewhere between burnt caramel and raw iron. One barrel stretched for weeks, feeding the entire population 3 times a day. By the time a man had served 5 years inside, the flavor of sorghum was soldered into his memory permanently, and the smell of it cooking could pull him back to that mess hall decades after release. Number 19. Fried timber rattlesnake from the Quarry Ridge. The mountains around Brushy Mountain were home to timber rattlesnakes that sunned themselves on rock ledges and along the quarry walls where inmates broke stone. Killing one was both a safety measure and a meal opportunity, and trustees who worked the quarry learned to pin them behind the head with a long-handled tool before cutting them clean. The kitchen skinned and gutted the snake, cut the body into short sections across the spine, dredged the pieces in cornmeal, and fried them in a cast-iron skillet of hot lard until the coating cracked golden and the small bones went brittle enough to chew through. The meat tasted clean and mild, closer to frog legs than chicken, with almost no fat of its own. Most men refused to try it the first time they saw it on a tray. The ones who did went back for seconds. A single large rattlesnake yielded enough fried sections to feed a dozen men, and every piece disappeared long before the line ran out. Number 18. Liver mush fried in lard until it shattered. Liver mush is a product of pure Appalachian thrift. Pork liver ground together with cornmeal, sage, black pepper, and whatever spices were on hand, pressed into a dense rectangular loaf, chilled until completely firm, sliced into thick slabs, and fried in hot lard until the outside developed a hard crust that cracked apart the moment you bit into it. Brushy Mountain served it at breakfast alongside scrambled eggs on mornings when the food budget could stretch to both. The taste is heavy, mineral-rich, and deeply polarizing. Half the inmate population looked forward to liver mush mornings. The other half scraped it off the tray untouched and traded their portion for tobacco, a favor owed, or simply left it sitting on the table for whoever wanted it. Number 17. Catfish pulled fresh from the Emory River. The Emory River runs through the valley near the prison grounds, and its deeper pools held channel catfish year-round. Fishing details were a known privilege reserved for trustees with consistently clean conduct records. They brought back catfish by the bucketful on productive afternoons, and the kitchen split the fillets, rolled them heavy in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in cast-iron skillets filled with smoking hot lard until the crust turned dark gold. On fish nights, the mess hall ran louder than any other evening of the week. Men argued openly over the belly sections where the meat is fattest and the cornmeal crust soaks up the most oil. Trays came back to the dish line with nothing on them but bones picked completely clean. Number 16. Head cheese pressed in the root cellar. When the prison butchered a hog, every single part found a use. The head was split in two, dropped into a boiling pot, and simmered for hours until every scrap of usable meat, cartilage, and connective tissue fell away from the skull. The meat was picked out by hand while still warm, seasoned with coarse salt, cracked black pepper, and a heavy splash of cider vinegar, then packed tightly into a rectangular mold and left in the cold root cellar overnight to set into a solid gelatin block. Sliced thin the next morning, it went on bread or was served cold alongside pickled beets. The texture was firm and slightly slippery. The flavor was pork without apology or disguise. Most inmates born after 1960 had never seen it served anywhere and did not recognize what they were eating. Number 15. Persimmon pudding baked from wild fallen fruit. The woods around the prison were full of American persimmon trees, and every autumn the small orange fruit dropped to the ground by the hundreds. Trustee crews gathered them in buckets during timber and clearing work, picking only the dead ripe ones that had gone soft enough to split in your hand, because an unripe persimmon will turn the inside of your mouth into chalk. The kitchen mashed the pulp through a colander to catch the seeds and the skin, mixed the strained paste with cornmeal, a pour of buttermilk from the dairy, and a scoop of sorghum molasses, then baked the batter in sheet pans until it set into something dense, sticky, and dark as molasses itself. The texture sat halfway between bread pudding and fudge. Persimmon pudding was an Appalachian tradition that predated the prison by generations, and it was one of the only desserts the kitchen produced that required zero purchased ingredients. Every component grew, grazed, or was milked on prison land. Number 14. Whole hog butchered and processed on site. Brushy Mountain ran its own hog operation on the prison farm for most of its history. Slaughter day arrived in late November, timed to the first hard cold snap so the carcasses would keep during the initial breakdown without need for mechanical refrigeration. Inmates performed every step under guard supervision. The killing, the scalding in massive iron kettles filled with boiling water to loosen the bristles, the careful scraping of the hide, and the methodical breaking of each carcass into primals and then into usable cuts. Every single part of the animal found a purpose over the following weeks and months. Hams were rubbed with salt and brown sugar and hung in the prison smokehouse where hickory logs burned low and slow for days. Shoulders went into braised roasts. Bellies were dry-cured and became the bacon served at breakfast. All excess fat was rendered in open kettles into clean white lard that powered the kitchen for months of frying and baking. Intestines were painstakingly stripped, soaked, and cleaned for chitlins. Bones dropped into the perpetual broth pot. Trim and offcuts were ground into bulk sausage seasoned with sage and red pepper. The men assigned to slaughter detail were covered in blood and viscera by midday, but they earned double rations and first pick of the fresh cuts. It was brutal, physical, messy work, and it was also one of the only days in the entire calendar year when the food coming out of that kitchen tasted like something a person made with intention rather than something an institution grudgingly produced. The pork chops served that first evening after a kill, cut thick from the loin and fried in their own freshly rendered fat with nothing but coarse salt, were the single best meal most inmates would eat until the next November came around. Number 13. Pawpaw fruit gathered from the forest floor. The pawpaw tree is native to the Tennessee woods and produces a soft, custard-like fruit that tastes like a natural cross between ripe banana, mango, and vanilla. It grows wild in the understory, drops from the branches in September, and spoils within 2 or 3 days of hitting the ground. Trustee crews on trail and road maintenance picked them up during their shifts and brought them back to the kitchen in buckets, where the fruit was split open and served raw or mashed into a simple custard that needed no added sugar at all. Inmates from Memphis or Nashville had never encountered the fruit in their lives and did not trust the tropical flavor coming from a Tennessee hillside. Appalachian natives recognized it instantly, said nothing, and cleared every piece before the skeptics had time to reconsider. Number 12. Snapping turtle soup from turtles caught on the grounds. Common snapping turtles wandered regularly onto the prison property from nearby creeks, ditches, and low ground, some of them old and heavy enough to weigh over 30 pounds. Catching a full-grown snapper required genuine caution because a large one can remove a finger with a single bite, and the neck extends far further than most people expect. Only certain experienced trustees handled the job. The kitchen butchered the animal carefully, separated the different textures of meat, and simmered everything slowly with rough-chopped onion, celery stalks, black pepper, and a long pour of apple cider vinegar to tenderize. Turtle meat is dense, chewy, and carries a flavor that sits somewhere between poultry and shellfish. One large snapper produced enough to feed dozens of men from a single pot. Number 11. Pruno, brewed from stolen kitchen fruit. This was the contraband that every man inside knew about, and no administration could ever fully eliminate. Inmates saved fruit scraps from their daily meal trays over days and weeks. Apple cores, orange peels, bruised peaches from the prison orchard, spotty bananas going soft. They mashed everything together inside a sealed plastic bag or a latex glove tied shut at the wrist, added sugar packets hoarded one at a time from the mess hall, wrapped the container in a towel or jammed it inside a thick sock for insulation, hid the package behind a heating pipe or deep under a mattress where it could stay warm and undisturbed, and waited. Within 5 to 7 days, the bag swelled tight with carbon dioxide from active fermentation, and the liquid inside turned cloudy, fizzy, and unmistakably alcoholic. The smell was impossible to contain, rotting fruit mixed with a sour, yeasty vinegar bite powerful enough to announce itself the moment a cell door cracked open. Guards found and confiscated batches during routine inspections constantly, pouring the contents down the shower drains. New batches started the same afternoon with fresh scraps. The cycle had no end point. The alcohol content was unpredictable and entirely dependent on the sugar-to-fruit ratio and the ambient warmth. Some cups barely registered stronger than old juice. Others landed with the sudden force of cheap corn whiskey and put men on their backs who were not bracing for it. There was no refrigeration available to inmates and no ice, so men drank it warm and fast, some stirring an extra sugar or powdered drink mix to mask the aggressive sourness, others just swallowing hard and ignoring the taste entirely. For men serving natural life with no parole hearing on the calendar and no release date anywhere in their future, a cup of Pruno shared between cellmates on a Friday night was the single thing that made 1 week feel any different from the hundreds that came before it and the hundreds that stretched ahead. Number 10. Venison from deer struck on the access road. White-tailed deer were abundant throughout Morgan County and crossed the prison access roads regularly, especially in the low light hours at dawn and dusk when work vehicles were moving. When a state truck hit one hard enough to kill it, or a perimeter guard brought one down that wandered inside the fence line, the carcass went directly to the kitchen rather than being left to rot. Trustees field-dressed the animal on site, then the kitchen broke it down into roasts, stew meat, or ground the trim into patties fried on the flat-top grill. Venison never appeared on any official rotation submitted to state inspectors, but it showed up on mess hall trays often enough during autumn months that long-term inmates knew the hunting season had started just by what their dinner tasted like. Number 9. Chitlins cleaned and fried on New Year's Day. Every 1st of January, without exception, the kitchen at Brushy Mountain cleaned and fried chitlins, hog intestines scraped and soaked repeatedly in cold water until the smell reduced to something manageable, boiled for several hours until the rubbery texture finally turned soft and tender, then battered in cornmeal and dropped into deep lard and fried until golden. The full preparation consumed an entire day of kitchen labor, and the smell of boiling intestines carried through every corridor, every vent, and every cell wing in the building hours before the food was plated. For black inmates from the rural South, eating chitlins on New Year's Day was family tradition that stretched back generations and connected a man to everyone who came before him. For inmates who had never encountered the dish, the smell alone was powerful enough to empty their half of the mess hall and send them straight to the commissary for crackers. Number 8. Garden tomatoes eaten warm and raw off the vine. The prison farm at Brushy Mountain grew rows of tomatoes every summer, tended entirely by inmate labor from planting to harvest. Trustees assigned to garden detail in July and August were known to pick ripe ones straight off the vine and eat them standing in the field, the fruit still holding the heat of the afternoon sun, juice and seeds running down their forearms and dripping into the red clay at their feet. It was technically classified as theft of state agricultural property. Nobody ever wrote a report. Nobody ever enforced it. A ripe tomato, eaten raw off the vine while standing in dirt under armed guard with a decade of sentence still ahead of you, was one of the very few moments inside Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary that actually tasted like being free. Number 7. Poke salad boiled 3 separate times. Pokeweed grows aggressively across Tennessee fields, roadsides, fence lines, and any patch of disturbed ground, and the mature plant is genuinely poisonous if consumed raw or undercooked. The young spring shoots had to be carefully harvested before they grew too tall, then boiled in a full pot of fresh water, drained completely, boiled a second time in new water, drained again, and boiled a third time before the greens were considered safe to serve. The Brushy Mountain kitchen prepared it as a cooked side dish alongside cornbread and beans during the spring months when the shoots were still young and tender enough to eat. Done correctly through all 3 water changes, the greens taste mild, slightly earthy, and similar to cooked spinach. Done wrong by skipping even one boil, pokeweed causes severe cramping, vomiting, and worse within hours of consumption. In over a century of continuous operations serving it to hundreds of men at a time, the kitchen never once got it wrong. Number 6. Muskrat trapped from the creek beds. Muskrat was actively hunted, sold at market, and commonly eaten across the Appalachian region well into the second half of the 20th century. At Brushy Mountain, trustees assigned to creek bank and drainage ditch maintenance pulled them from simple wire traps set along the waterways that crossed prison property. The meat is dark red, lean, finely grained, and carries a flavor that sits somewhere between wild rabbit and roasted duck. The kitchen skinned the animals, soaked the meat overnight in salted water, and either roasted them whole with root vegetables or chopped the meat into winter stews alongside potatoes, onion, and whatever else was available when other protein ran short. Most inmates eating the stew never knew what kind of animal provided the meat. The men who recognized the taste kept quiet about it and went back through the line for seconds. Number 5. Pickled everything stored in the root cellar. Brushy Mountain preserved food for the long mountain winters the same way Appalachian families had done it for generations before refrigeration existed. Vinegar, coarse salt, and thyme. Cucumbers, beets, green tomatoes, hot peppers, hard-boiled eggs, corn relish, onions, and pig feet all went into glass jars by the dozens each autumn when the garden was producing more than the kitchen could use fresh, and those jars lined the root cellar shelves until they were needed months later. By February, when the prison garden was frozen dead and no fresh produce shipments had arrived in weeks, the daily meal trays were lined with pickled vegetables as the only side available. The sharp vinegar cut clean through the heaviness of pinto beans and fatback and gave the plate a bright, acidic contrast it badly needed. Number 4. Perpetual bone broth that never stopped simmering. When every usable scrap of protein had been carved, pulled, or scraped from the bones, those bones still had one more job. The kitchen dropped hog spines, chicken carcasses, ham hocks stripped bare, knuckle joints, and whatever other skeletal remains accumulated throughout the week into a massive stockpot that simmered continuously on the back burner around the clock. By day 3 or 4, the liquid had turned dark, thick and gelatinous from the collagen slowly dissolving out of the joints. They poured it steaming over rice, soaked stale bread in it until the bread fell apart, or ladled it straight into tin cups and served it as a standalone meal on the days between meat deliveries. The pot never fully emptied before new bones went in. Old broth merged with new, and the cycle ran unbroken for weeks at a stretch. Number 3. Muscadine wine fermented in hidden places. Muscadine grapes grew wild and heavy on the hillside surrounding the prison perimeter fence, and every autumn the thick-skinned purple fruit dropped from the vines faster than the birds and deer could consume it. Inmates on outside work details pocketed them by the handful every day the vines were producing. Back inside, they crushed the grapes into sealed bags, added granulated sugar smuggled from the mess hall one stolen packet at a time over weeks of patience, and stashed the fermenting mixture behind ceiling tiles, inside wall cavities, taped to warm pipes running through the coal mine tunnels, or buried in the recreation yard under landmarks only they could recognize. Unlike Pruno made from kitchen scraps, Muscadine wine made with real grapes and enough time could actually produce something worth drinking. Batches left undiscovered for 2 or 3 months developed into a genuinely smooth, deeply purple sweet wine with real body and legitimate strength. Guards found stashes on a regular basis during searches. Guards missed just as many. Every autumn, the cycle began fresh without fail. Number 2. Full Thanksgiving dinner served with every traditional trimming. Once a year, usually on the Thursday of the holiday itself, the kitchen at Brushy Mountain produced a meal that did not look, smell, or taste anything like institutional prison food. Roast turkey carved from whole birds, cornbread dressing made from scratch with sage and onion, mashed potatoes swimming in thick gravy, green beans slow-cooked in ham stock, cranberry sauce from a can set in a bowl at the center of each table, and a wedge of pecan pie to finish the plate. The warden approved the full expense every November as a calculated strategy designed to reduce tensions and keep the population manageable through the long, dark, freezing winter months that followed. Men who had been locked inside for decades said Thanksgiving was the single day of the year when they could close their eyes over a plate, put the fork in their mouth, and genuinely forget for a few seconds exactly where they were sitting. The mess hall went silent on Thanksgiving in a way it never went silent on any other day of the year. Nobody argued over portions. Nobody traded. Everyone ate everything. Number 1. Hot buttermilk biscuits with fresh churned butter from the prison dairy. Brushy Mountain operated its own small dairy herd on the prison farm for most of its history. Every morning before the sun broke over the eastern ridge, trustees assigned to dairy detail walked down to the barn in the dark, milked the cows by hand into steel pails, separated the cream, and worked a hand-crank churn until butter came together in a pale yellow block still cold from the milk. Meanwhile, the kitchen mixed biscuits from scratch using nothing but flour, a spoon of lard, and the buttermilk left over from that same churning, then slid the pans into the coal-fired ovens that also heated the cell block hallways through winter. When the timing aligned, and it did not always align because the dairy crew and the baking crew operated on different schedules controlled by different guards, a man could sit down at his assigned place at 6 in the morning to a biscuit pulled hot from the oven, split it open with his thumbs, and set a pat of butter on the steaming interior that was still fresh and soft from the churn less than an hour before he ate it. For 30 seconds, with that taste in his mouth, the walls did not exist. Nobody would call it a feast. Nobody would call it exotic or dramatic or impressive by any standard a free person would recognize. The whole meal was bread and butter, both made that same morning by hand from animals kept on the same land where the man slept. That simplicity is exactly why it belongs at the top of this list. Men who served 20 years and more inside Brushy Mountain remembered those early mornings clearly long after they had forgotten the fights, the freezing cell blocks, the coal dust lining their lungs, and the heavy sound of the doors locking shut every night. Guards who pulled the dawn shift for years admitted after retirement that they ate the same biscuits standing in the corridor every morning and never found their equal at any table since. A hot biscuit with fresh butter, eaten by a man who has nowhere to go and nothing ahead except the next morning, was the wildest meal Brushy Mountain ever served. It proved that even 100 years of stone walls, coal mines, and razor wire could never take absolutely everything from the men locked inside. Every meal on this list was real, served on metal trays inside stone walls that still stand in the mountains of East Tennessee. Brushy Mountain locked its last cell in 2009, but the men who ate this food carried those tastes with them long after release. Some were brutal, some were beautiful. All of them reveal more about daily life inside those walls than any court record or sentence length ever could. Which meal surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more hidden food history where this came from. Until next time.